First and foremost, Joe Biden.
Wow. Okay.
I would say the worst president.
The worst.
In the history of the United States of America.
Wow.
For foreign policy. Yes. Completely misjudged the time and allowed various, I was going to say second rate. Honestly, they don't even deserve a ranking. Foreign policy folks to run the country's foreign policy. So Joe Biden is number one. George W. Bush, number two. LBJ, number three. Eisenhower and JF Kennedy. Round out my top 5 worst presidents for foreign policy. I admire LBJ immensely for what he did domestically in many ways. One of the greatest LBJs.
Come here. You're going to sit with me for the part of the conversation, okay?
Rags to riches stories, I think in American history, just an incredible man in many, many ways. But I think the Vietnam thing was terrible. And to his credit, although he's on my list of the 5 losers, he had the gumption and the knowledge that he effed up. He knew that and he accepted it. I think we should close this with the Joe Biden verdict. Why is it that you don't think, he's not on your dishonorable mentions.
No, he was middling for me. Like he's not great. He wasn't terrible. Like he made some obvious mistakes. He's like the last gasp of neoconservatism. Like I can't believe that he brought that failed policy back. I think you're right. I think he doubled down on great power competition with China, which was ultimately going to be unproductive. In Afghanistan, he's the one who had the balls to get out. He was the one who ended the forever wars. All of you folks who think that it was Trump. Like it was Biden who took the flak to do it.
Well, the reason I don't give him credit for it is the same reason I don't give him flack for it, which is that if Donald Trump had been the president, if he had won the election in 2020, we would have had the exact same outcome in Afghanistan because it was his policy. So it is what it is. To me, there's 2 really, really critical reasons why I have Joe Biden here. The first and foremost is not defining what victory in Ukraine looks like. And we're still paying for that. This notion that Ukraine must win, which is a mantra repeated by the Joe Biden acolytes in Washington, D.C. Like you would go to a CFR talk in D.C. or you would go to any event in Washington, D.C. and they would breathlessly repeat it, just like God bless United States of America and God bless our troops. It was Ukraine must win. That was the end of every breathless speech by a Joe Biden administration official. It's like, okay, but what does that mean? Because I can tell you that there's no chance in hell that Ukraine will win those territories back. So is the intention of the United States of America to pursue a conflict that will eventually drain Ukraine of its blood and its people because you clearly are not sending them any troops? So what does that mean? And then, of course, Nord Stream, which I think has massively disrupted U.S.-European alliance. You're destroying a piece of infrastructure that the Germans paid for. And, you can talk about Trump and his behavior and how he has led to a loss of confidence between Europe and the U.S. That started under Biden. And then finally, I would say the start of the conflict in Ukraine, we forget that it was the United States of America that encouraged Zelensky and Kiev to abandon the European negotiated peace deal with Russia, which was unfair to Ukraine. I completely objectively agree. The Minsk protocols and the Minsk agreements definitely were not good for Ukraine. They effectively gave the pro-Russian rebels a veto over future Ukrainian, European economic and NATO integration. I agree with this. But there was a reason that Germany and France negotiated those with Russia, because they don't care. They care about their own interests. And so Joe Biden shows up and says to Zelensky right off the bat, you don't have to abide by any of these agreements that ended the war from 2014 to 2015. So I disagree with John Mersheimer. I disagree with him that Russia invaded Ukraine because of NATO expansion. But the reason Russia did invade Ukraine is because it saw an America that was supporting a much more aggressive Kiev, unlike the pre-Zelensky administration of Poroshenko, which did sit down and did negotiate the Minsk protocols because the Germans and the French were like, look, we're not going to have a land war in Europe. You're going to have to give the Russians something. And then America shows up and it's like, nah, we're the hegemon. Ukraine must win. Let's go. So yeah, I do think you can blame Joe Biden for the start of the war in Ukraine. And when Donald Trump says this will never happen under my watch, I actually think he's right.
Well, I think that's a little far. I disagree with you on this. I think Putin lost it a little bit and made a mistake. And as we talked about in our league, he was brilliant for decades, and he made one mistake, and he's in such a weak position that he makes one mistake, and it all comes falling down. I mean what I say when he's the last gasp of the neoconservatives. His biggest mistake, and he had some successes. There's pulling out of Afghanistan. There's putting the Japan-South Korea relationship back together. He never gets credit for that. That was something that he did that was good, reinforcing U.S. relationships with European allies. But I think the thing that he really missed was he, like so many in his party and so many leaders around the world, convinced themselves that the first Trump administration was just a fever dream, that it was some kind of aberration, and that it was his job to return things to the way that they were before and set things back. And what he really had was he had a 4-year period where if he had been thinking not of his legacy and not of a second term or not of spreading U.S. ideals around the world by having Ukraine stand up to Russia or insulting Mohammed bin Salman or any of the other things, he had just thought about, I have 4 years to prepare the world for multipolar America, so to reinforce relationships with the countries is going to be really important to reinforce them with, so that when somebody like Donald or Donald comes back, they can't just break things. Like I spend these next 4 years building fences around the things that I think are important for the United States going forward. Like he had a tremendous opportunity there. And instead, he chose to believe that, to your point, it was the 1990s, which in his head, Marco, it might have been the 1990s. Like maybe he's the Woodrow Wilson of the 21st century, just lost it.
First of all, preach on everything you just said. Absolutely correct. But I want to say one more thing. The one thing, so Joe Biden, Blinken, Sullivan, they walk into the White House and they effectively say everything that Donald Trump touched is soiled. We're going to do the
except tariffs on China.
Except tariffs on China. No, more broadly than that, except a broad economic assault on China that does not open any negotiations. So my biggest problem with the Joe Biden administration is that they come in, they do that idiotic summit in Alaska with China, and then they effectively don't communicate with China at all in a reasonable way. There were meetings, there were working groups, but for the most part, all you see during the Biden administration is the ratcheting of tensions. Now, Jake Sullivan comes out with his small garden, high walls strategy. No, we're just going to focus on high tech. But that's not what the Chinese see on the other side. They see effectively a U.S. administration that doesn't have the political room to maneuver domestically because they're afraid of being accused of being soft in China. Very similar to your problem with Truman.
Yes, it's the Democrats' biggest issue. They're worried about being soft on China. So it's why we go into Korea. It's why we go into Vietnam. It's like the Democrats don't want to be soft on China because FDR thought he lost China because he thought he supported the road episode. You talked a lot about FDR earlier, like his whole thing with Mao and Chiang Kai-shek, like that's a dark mark on his work.
But I don't think it's a Democratic concern with being soft in China. I think it's the Democrats always have a problem, and it's unfair. And I feel bad. They have an albatross around their back, which is that they're seen as a party of peace and doves. It's not just China, Jacob. It's like it's difficult for the Democrats to make a deal with any enemy. And so Donald Trump flies up into the air in an airplane. That airplane is called being tough in China. And then midway, we changed up pilots. And Joe Biden's like, well, I can't land this plane because if I do, I'm going to be accused of being soft. And so he keeps flying that plane with no direction, with no sense of what are we trying to get? What are we extracting from China? What's the purpose of American, assertiveness here? What is it that we're trying to change in China's behavior? And so instead, it just leads China and the U.S. on a path that if Kamala Harris had gotten elected, I fear could have gotten really bad. I don't think that Harris had any plan to negotiate with China on anything because that was just not acceptable politically. The reason I have Joe Biden as the worst president of foreign policy is because his team and himself, they live in a social media age. They live in an age where foreign policy has never been as democratically discussed domestically as in the past. And they were so susceptible to those pressures. They not once stood on an objective, realist, pragmatic principle and said, you know what? Ukraine should win, but maybe we need to talk with Russia about where their sphere of influence starts and where it ends. And yes, China's the rival, but let's create a framework where we can not go to World War III. And so that's my biggest problem. And I think that hopefully we won't be going back to that foreign policy because in a multipolar world, it's very dangerous to be normatively and morally based. And so that's why he's my number one.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said. I just wouldn't put him worse. And I like the things you're talking about. It's that's George W. It's just the last gasp of George W.
Yes, but you know what the difference is? And this is why I have him ahead of George W. You're right. It is. The difference is that George W. Bush inherited that preponderance of power. Not to excuse him, but if you're going to bundle American foreign policy using moralistic and value-laden, I would rather you do that when America is unipolar than multipolar. Now, You can argue George W. Bush ushered in a multipolar world because he wasted so many of Americans' resources. And that's where, like, he is number 2 in my book. But Joe Biden misjudged the world he's in. George W. Bush's error is that he wasted American unipolarity. Joe Biden's problem is that he thought he was still running a unipolar world, and so almost started World War III as a result of his actions.